Hey everyone, welcome to our second lecture. For this week's lecture, we're going to explore in more detail the main goal for this course, happiness and well-being. We're going to seek to define these constructs, talk some about their history and how we measure them today, and finish with a discussion of some of the variables that show no association with them, even though people often mistakenly think they do. This is going to be a bit longer of a lecture since we have a lot to get in. Let's start with the definitions. If you were to stop someone on the street or ask a family member or a friend to give you a definition of happiness, what do you think they would say? How do you think they would describe it? If you want, go ahead and pause the video for a moment and go ask the first person you see this question. The person you ask would probably recognize that happiness is an emotion. Now, according to the American Psychological Association, emotions are a conscious mental reaction subjectively experienced as strong feelings, usually directed toward a specific object and typically accompanied by physiological and behavioral changes in the body. A few key things in that definition. So, an emotion is something that is conscious. In other words, we as humans are usually aware of them. So we have to be aware of the experience of being happy in order to have that experience. Now, we may not always have the words to label it, but we recognize that it is happening. You'll also notice in that definition that it is a mental state. So it is happening in our minds, but it brings physiological and behavioral changes as well. We'll talk about those in more detail in a second, but basically, this is saying that when we experience happiness, it is not just a thought process, but there are actual changes that happen in our body chemistry, and there are usually outward signs that show we are happy as well. Now, there is some debate about what comes first. Some people say it's the physical and physiological response based on the situation, past memories, and anticipation. We have that response first, and then we mentally interpret it as being happy. Others say the mental experience comes first, based on the situation, past memories, and anticipation. And the physical and physiological responses follow the mental experience. Now, either way, emotions are there to teach us something or remind us of something about the world around us and teach us how to interact with it. So, the average person, when thinking of a definition of happiness, might be able to recognize that happiness is an emotion, but they might have a hard time coming up with the words to describe it beyond that. This is because happiness is considered a basic emotion, kind of like how it is difficult to describe salt, which is a basic ingredient. It can also be difficult to describe happiness because it's a basic emotion. Some have suggested that there are six basic emotions. Besides happiness or joy, these basic emotions also include fear, disgust, anger, surprise, and sadness. Now, of these six, happiness is the only one that is universally considered to be a positive thing. So, it is our mind and body trying to tell us that the situation we are in is positive or enjoyable. It is also considered to be the direct opposite of the basic emotion, sadness. Now, as the average person tries to define happiness, they might also describe it by using some of its synonyms. We already mentioned joy as being one of them, but there is also bliss, contentment, pleasure, satisfaction, cheerfulness, merriness, delirium, ecstasy, exhilaration, gaiety, jubilance, and so on. Now, some of these synonyms represent different levels of happiness. For example, euphoric could be seen as a very high level of happiness, And pleased or contentment might be seen as a smaller level of happiness. And other synonyms represent a mixture of happiness with another feeling. For example, awe or wonder might be a mixture of both happiness and surprise. As the average person tries to define happiness, I bet you would also see them express some of the nonverbal signs of this emotion. Happiness is associated with a certain type of smile called the Duchenne smile. This smile includes a narrowing of the eyes, with some wrinkling around the corners of them, a raising of the cheeks, and a pulling back of the lips, with the teeth often being exposed. Now, often we tell people to smile when we want to take a picture. This is so they look happy. But you'll notice that when some people smile for a picture, it is obvious that it is forced or fake. And this often happens when it doesn't include all of the elements that I just described. Getting someone to say cheese focuses on these elements, forcing them to happen. Interestingly, people in many different countries use words with an E sound to encourage people to smile. For example, many South American countries ask people to say whiskey. In Brazil, they say the letter X, which is pronounced something like chis. And in China, they say eggplant, which is pronounced chiezi. And finally, in Korea, they say kimchi. Fascinatingly, early research suggested that the facial expressions for happiness are universal. In early studies, people were shown pictures of a person showing a certain facial expression. Almost always, the facial expression showing a Duchenne smile was identified as the emotion happiness. But this could be because with the increase in global media, travel, and global communication, people all over the world are now being exposed to similar social norms and customs. In fact, recent research in more remote cultures has shown discrepancies where the facial expression that is always identified as happy in one culture is only identified as happy maybe 50% of the time in another culture. Now, interestingly, though, the facial expression of happiness does seem to be the most universal of the facial expressions for the six basic emotions. And besides the facial expressions, some of the other nonverbal cues of happiness include a more upright, attentive posture, openness, such as arms uncrossed, more frequent eye contact, and larger but relaxed body movements. Even breathing changes when someone is happy. Research suggests that when someone is happy, their breathing rate speeds up slightly, and they take in less air with each breath. There's also a little more variability in the breathing than in a baseline state. In addition to these outward signs of happiness, changes inside our body also occur when we're happy. Our brain functions by sending messages from one neuron or cell to another. These messages are sent through an electrical transmission within the cell and a chemical transmission between the cells. The chemicals that are transmitted are called neurotransmitters. Now, there are likely over 100 different types of neurotransmitters that operate within our body, but really less than a dozen or so of them that play a significant role. And with happiness, we see an increased level of dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin. And because of this, these four are sometimes referred to as the feel good hormones. Now, certain neurons within the brain respond specifically to these neurotransmitters. So, when the level of these feel good hormones are elevated, our brains can send messages to those neurons and then to the rest of our body in a more effective and faster way. While the neurons in very specific areas of our brain are activated for certain types of memories, cognitive tasks, or sensations, we see many areas of the brain seem to be activated when we're happy. So, given this widespread activation in our brain, it's made it somewhat difficult to identify the exact neuroanatomy of happiness. Now, even if we don't know the exact neuroanatomy of happiness, we do know that it is a universally desired trait. Across cultures and times, happiness has been viewed as a positive thing and something that almost everyone desires. Because of this, philosophers have talked about happiness and the pursuit thereof for thousands of years. For example, the well known Greek philosopher Aristotle is quoted as saying, "Happiness is the meaning and the purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence." And saying this, he was emphasizing that happiness should rise above things like pleasure, status, and wealth. And around the same time, Mencius, a Chinese philosopher, talked about how happiness and joy are natural and automatic reactions that we have in response to the satisfaction we feel from living a virtuous life. But even before both of them, happiness and the pursuit thereof is mentioned in several religious texts. For example, several of the early books of the Bible talk about how happiness and joy are found in the Lord and following his commandments. The Quran talks about how earning an eternal, enduring happiness in the next life is the ultimate goal or purpose of this life. And in the Dhammapada, which contains the teachings of Buddha, it describes happiness as something we can earn through our thoughts and deeds. Notice how all of these early teachings emphasize that happiness is something that is earned or obtained through effort. I think another quote by Aristotle captures this well. He said, "Happiness depends on ourselves." Today, in the field of psychology, researchers often refer to happiness as the construct of well being, hence, well being being used in the title of this course. This type of happiness is a sense or belief that one has a good life. Now, good is considered to be subjective from one person to another in this definition, and so it is more about the satisfaction individuals experience in their own lives. Again, not about the situations they are in, but about the satisfaction with their situations. And you'll notice in these definitions that the construct of well being is a bit broader than the construct of happiness. Happiness seems to describe a state like experience that can be of either a short or long duration. For example, one can be happy while watching a funny movie or eating a favorite food, but then not happy again once the movie is over or the food is gone. On the other hand, one's sense of well being is a more global trait. Someone who has a high sense of well being is generally happy most of the time. Now, Abraham Maslow was one of the first psychologists to talk about well being when he presented his hierarchy of needs in 1943. At the very bottom level, Maslow described physiological needs, such as food, water, and clothes. Needs related to safety were placed second, including financial security and personal security. Interestingly, Maslow placed health and well being here too. This suggests that, according to Maslow, the pursuit of well being is considered a more fundamental motivator than the pursuit of social belonging and love, self esteem, and self actualization. Now, although Maslow considered well being a basic need, it is not until the state of self actualization at the very top where he suggested that we're able to pursue real happiness. Thus, according to Maslow, it appears that well being may have multiple dimensions or levels that are more or less fundamental to survival. Now, although many other psychologists have written about and studied well being since Abraham Maslow first talked about it as a construct, a researcher named Ed Diener is often considered the preeminent authority on the topic. In fact, he's often referred to in the field as Dr. Happiness. He coined the term subjective well-being, emphasizing that the focus should be placed on how one feels about one's situation rather than the situation itself. And according to Diener, one sense of well-being can fall on a continuum from flourishing on one end to languishing on the other. When one is flourishing, not only do they feel happy and satisfied with their life, but they also are growing and developing and having a positive effect on those around them. There's a sense of kind of forward movement with flourishing, whereas languishing represents a stagnation and backward movement. So, in summary, happiness is an emotion that is experienced at a mental, biological, physical, and behavioral level. It is universally considered to be a positive emotion and something worth pursuing. And it is something we can gain based on our actions and the perspectives we take, rather than something that happens to us based on the circumstances or situations that we are in. I'd like to focus the rest of our lecture today on that topic: situations that we think will bring happiness, but they don't. Let me start with an example. Some of you may be familiar with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Early in the history of this church, believers were kicked out of their homes in Missouri. Eliza Snow journaled her experience during this exile, and the following, as told by Russell M. Nelson, is a recount from her journal. One evening, Eliza's family spent the night in a small log cabin with others who were fleeing. Much of the chinking between the logs had been extracted and burned for firewood by those who preceded them, so there were holes between the logs large enough for a cat to crawl through. It was bitter cold, and their food was frozen solid. That night, some 80 people huddled inside the small cabin, only 20 feet square. Most sat or stood all night trying to keep warm. Outside, a group of men spent the night gathered around a roaring fire, with some singing church songs and others roasting potatoes. Eliza recorded, "Not a complaint was heard. All were cheerful, and judging from appearances, strangers would have taken us to be pleasure excursionists rather than a band of gubernatorial exiles. That was a very merry night." I love this story because it shows that happiness is not about our situation. Oftentimes, when people think about happiness, they think about the conditions that would allow them to be happy. In other words, they think about the situations that they would be in or the possessions that they would have that would make them happy. And perhaps you found yourself thinking that way too at times. I know I have. I sometimes think, I would be happy if I get such and such, or when such and such happens, then I will be happy. But these types of statements that we tell ourselves are usually based on mistaken assumptions. I'd like to share about a few of those mistaken assumptions now. Things that we believe will make us happy, but really the existing research suggests that they won't. Let's start with money and possessions. Is there a significant relationship between the amount of money people make, their income, and their level of happiness? Well, if you ask the average American, there is. In one survey, nearly 80% of the population stated that they would be happier if they had more money. And when looking at this question at a very surface level, yes, there is a significant correlation between these two variables. The more money one makes, the happier they are. But there are some big caveats to this relationship that might lead us to believe that money is actually not related to happiness at all. First, it's important to note that when looking at the data from all the studies that have been conducted in the many different countries across the globe, the correlation between income and happiness is fairly small, between maybe 0.13 and 0.23. That suggests that the slice of the pie, um, that happiness explains is really only maybe, I mean, that money explains of happiness is really only maybe 1% to 5% of that variance. So a very, very thin slice. And that small percentage is far different from the belief that if I had, say, $1 million, then I would be happy. That type of belief assumes a 100% overlap or relationship between the variables. Second, researchers have broken down the data by country. And what they have found is that in countries that are well off, the correlation between income and happiness is very small. But in countries that are poorer, the correlation is sometimes quite large. This suggests that the relationship is not about having money or having a lot of it, but instead, people are happier when they can afford to meet their basic needs. Third, the studies that exist suggest that the relationship between money and happiness is relative. In a recent review, they found that when the income levels of people within a country were pretty similar, everybody made about the same amount of money, similar wealth was kind of dispersed around, the correlation between happiness and income was again small. However, when there was a wealth gap, the relationship between these two variables was much larger. So this suggests that it's not the money that makes someone happier, but it is the fact that one has more money than someone else. Now, speaking to this idea of comparisons further illustrates the point that money and possessions are not the thing that causes people to be happy. In particular, there is this thing that people sometimes do called upward social comparisons. This describes the act of comparing yourself to someone who has more than you. It could be someone who has a bigger house, a higher paying job, fancier cars, better grades, or any other thing. And research suggests that the more often we engage in these types of comparisons, the unhappier we are. So, for example, in any given neighborhood, the person with the largest house is more likely to be happy and satisfied with their house. And the person with the smallest house is more likely to be sad and dissatisfied with their house. So you might be thinking, doesn't this suggest that money and possessions are related to happiness? Those with small houses are less happy, and those with big houses are happier? But if you think deeper about the situation, you will notice that it is not about the house or the money. If you took the person with the smallest house in the well off neighborhood and you moved their exact same house to the poorer neighborhood, they would now have the largest house on the block. And they would go from being unhappy to happy, even though their income and their house size did not change. So it is the perspective we take rather than the money and possessions that we have that affects our happiness. Last, if there was a true relationship between money and possessions and happiness, you would have to expect that as one goes up, so does the other. But that is not the case. In the United States, people are making way more money than they used to. In, for example, 1990, the median household income in the United States was just under $31,000. Today, it's just under $75,000. In 1950, the average home size was just under 1,000 square feet. In 1970, it was right at 1,500 square feet. And today, it is right at 2,500 square feet, all while the average number of people in a house has been going down. Compared to the 1960s, today much fewer households own 0 to 1 car. 80% of the households in 1960s owned 0 or 1 car, and today it's 40%. And many more households own 2 or more vehicles, only 20% in the 1960s and 60% today. So we see all of these signs that on average in the US, we are richer and we have more possessions than any time in the past. With all of this wealth, one would expect that we would also be happier, but we're not. Instead, in the US, our happiness seems to be going down. The following is data from the latest World Health Report, and it covers the past 17 years. The ratings in this study are done on a 10-point scale, with higher scores representing more positive self-reports. And you'll see some fluctuations from year to year, but there's a pretty clear downward trend. So even though our wealth is increasing, our happiness is going down. So we know money and possessions cannot buy happiness. What else? Well, just like money, people often assume that status, success, or achievement will bring happiness. People think once I get a job or a promotion, once I graduate, or once I achieve a certain goal, then I will be happy. But this is referred to as the arrival fallacy, because once we do get there, we usually do not get the happiness we were predicting. Now, striving for success and achievement is important. I do see value in always trying to improve, become better, and contribute positively to society. But we have to remember that this is separate from happiness. The existing research suggests that having success and accomplishing things in and of itself will not bring happiness. In fact, it may actually decrease it. One interesting finding that illustrates this point is the fact that CEOs have been found to experience depression at more than twice the rate of the general population. And research has shown that people who value things associated with status and success, whether or not they achieve those things, are typically less happy than people who place their values elsewhere. So, why is this? Why would achievement and success lead to less happiness? Well, there's several reasons for this. First, similar to what we talked about with money, one theory suggests that success does not lead to happiness because of the social comparisons that always occur. There was a very interesting study published in 1995 related to this that you may have heard about. Researchers in this study examined the reactions of gold, silver, and bronze medalists in the 1992 Summer Olympics. They studied their reactions immediately at the conclusion of their events, as well as on the medal stand, like in the picture here. If achievement was linked to happiness, then one would expect the gold medalist to show the most positive reaction, followed by the silver medalist, and followed last by the bronze medalist. But that is not what they found. Instead, they found that the bronze medalists were typically happier than the silver medal winners. Now, they suggested that this effect was due to counterfactual thinking. The silver medalists compared themselves to the gold medalists and thought, I was so close, I could have won gold. The bronze medalists instead compared themselves to non-medal winners and thought, I was so close, I could have not medaled at all. So while the silver medalists compared up and saw their failures, the bronze medalists compared down and saw their successes. In other words, as we focus on achievement, we can sometimes fall into a trap of comparing ourselves to higher and higher social groups and never be satisfied with the gains that we have made. So a successful CEO might compare herself to other CEOs rather than to the thousands of employees that work under her. A high school student who gets an A minus in an honors class might compare herself to all the other students who get A's in the class, rather than the students who get B's and C's in the regular classes. And a musician studying at Juilliard compares his performance to the other musicians at Juilliard, rather than the thousands who would never even come close to making it into the school. Because our comparison groups always change, it can be difficult to find happiness in the achievements we make. Another theory for why status and success are not linked to happiness is referred to as hedonic adaptation. Now, most of the time when we experience a positive event, we will feel happy for a short period of time. But then that achievement that we just made becomes the new normal, and it no longer brings the desired happiness. A great example of this is when children open up desired gifts on their birthdays. It's often difficult for them to contain their excitement and happiness as they rip the presents out of the box. But after a few days of playing with whatever toy they got, or sometimes even just a few hours, the toy ends up collecting dust on a shelf or in a corner somewhere. We see this all the time in academia, too. I remember when I published my very first article as a graduate student. I printed it up on nice paper, sent copies to my parents and my in laws, and my wife and I went out to celebrate. Now, over 100 articles later, I sometimes even forget to place my recently accepted articles on my CV. It's no longer the same achievement. I also remember one of my previous clients who was seeing me to get help on his social anxiety. This was in the early days of Facebook. He told me about how he constantly worried about the number of friends that he had. When he first got an account, he was able to add a couple of friends right away, but he was immediately worried that it wasn't enough. He was worried that everyone would see it and think he was a loser for not having more friends. So he said to himself, if I could just get 10 friends, then that would be enough and he'd be happy. Well, the weeks went by and he eventually got 10 friends. And although that made him happy for a little while, it quickly dissipated and the thoughts returned that it wasn't enough. So then he told himself that he needed 50 friends in order to be happy. But then again, when he got that, it wasn't enough. Eventually, he wanted 100, 150, then 500 friends. And getting the achievement that he desired always became the new normal. And it never brought the happiness that he thought it would. Another theory for why achievement does not lead to happiness has been referred to as purpose dissipation. As you are working toward a goal, you have a purpose or drive in your life. And having a purpose, as we'll talk about later in this course, does bring happiness. Not only does it provide meaning to your life, it keeps you active and moving forward. You are always working towards something. But once you achieve that big goal, the purpose is gone. And rather than basking in the glory from the success for the rest of your life, people often describe waking up the day after achieving a big goal feeling lost or stuck, wondering what to do next to bring meaning to their life. Last, status and achievements may not lead to happiness because they often come at a cost to other things that are associated with positive well being. Things like sleep, family relationships, hobbies, other rewarding activities, and even freedom. For example, one might think that a CEO for a company might have more freedom and thus more happiness than the person who delivers mail in the office. But the CEO has to be accountable to stakeholders, has to constantly worry about the company, and may have difficulty taking a vacation, feeling that the company depends on her being there to run it. None of that pressure and loss of freedom is experienced by the office mail worker. They get to go home at the end of their shift and spend their time however they want. And they have the freedom to let go of work completely and do other enjoyable activities. When I was offered my current job at Idaho State University, I also received an offer from another school. The other university offered me twice the salary that ISU was offering. In addition, they offered me a high status position within the department. However, it was a year round position where they would expect me to be in the office from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day throughout the entire year. Instead, the ISU position was only a 9-month position, meaning that I would be out of work at the same time my children were out of school. And although the higher pay and higher status offer was hard to turn down, I knew that I gained the most of my happiness out of spending time with my family. And so no amount of money was going to be worth giving that up. I want to finish this section on status and achievement by mentioning that while most studies show that success, status, and achievement are not at all related to happiness, there are a few that have found a positive relationship between these variables. However, most of the studies that have found a positive relationship have used a correlational design, where it's impossible to know cause and effect. In contrast, longitudinal studies can help us identify the temporal ordering of these variables. In one such longitudinal study with nearly 1 million participants, they were all US Army soldiers, the researchers found that happiness was associated with achievement, as measured by the number of awards that the soldier had received. But it was the happiness that likely caused the success, not the success that caused the happiness. In this study, happiness was measured at the very beginning of service. Then the researchers tracked the participants for 4 years to identify the number of service awards they received during that time period. Those who had the highest levels of happiness at time one, on average, earned 4 times the number of awards as the service members with the lowest levels of happiness at time one. Now, these findings suggest that if you can be happy, then you'll be successful, rather than when you are successful, then you will be happy. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about today is something that has been shown to actually take away happiness, and that is the internet and social media use. On average, adults in the US spend 7 hours per day on screens, and that represents 40% of our waking hours. But it is even worse for US teenagers, who spend an average of 9 hours on screens every day. And maybe you're thinking that most of that time is probably spent on work or homework, but that type of productive screen time was not included in these calculations. Here's a table showing how teens in the US use their screen time. Now, sadly, the time spent on screens is increasing every year, especially as younger and younger children are given cell phones and access to social media. And although we are still just beginning to discover the negative effects associated with excessive social media and screen use, the existing research seems to demonstrate a clear negative relationship between internet use and happiness. This figure is for youth and only goes up until 2017, but you can see in it that as internet use has gone up over the years, the red line, there has been a steady decline in happiness, the purple line. Now, interestingly, the same report, the World Happiness Report, outlined the things that are associated with happiness, the top bars that go to the right. And they outline the things associated with unhappiness, the bottom bars that go to the left. And again, this is for youth. You'll notice that all of the things that are tied to lower happiness at the bottom of the graph have to do with screens, and most are activities done on a cell phone. And now we're coming to better understand just how addictive social media is, leading many to describe social media as the new nicotine. Although the internet has led to amazing advancements in our world, excessive use leads to isolation and unhealthy social comparison. And these two things lead to less happiness. So, in summary, money, possessions, status, achievement, the internet, and even social media are not inherently bad things. They can all be used for good, and we can be happy and still have or use all of them. But we also have to recognize that as we specifically seek after these things, the harder it is to actually find happiness. Fortunately, finding happiness is not a difficult thing to do. We just have to know where to look. And that is what we will focus on for the rest of this class. Discussing the things that do lead to happiness and helping you cultivate those things in your life. Now, this is the purpose of self-care. When most people think about self-care, images of, say, bubble baths and balanced rocks and peaceful meditation come to mind. And people see self care as relaxing and taking a break from focusing on other things in life. And they see it as a focus just on the self. Now, while taking a break and focusing on the self can be useful at times, this is not the essence of self care. Instead, self care is about the pursuit of happiness, growth, and holistic well being. And sometimes that pursuit is relaxing and focused on the self, but other times it takes work and effort and a focus on others. And through consistent effort on the right things, the things we'll discuss in this course, one can definitely develop happiness in their lives. Again, hope you enjoyed the lecture today. If you have any questions on any of it, feel free to send me an email anytime. Take care.